Your Grace, that word does not mean ownership. It means custody.
What?
What would you do if the truth sitting in your throat could either save 100 families or end your entire future in a single breath? Lady Margaret Vance had asked herself that question every night for 3 years. Tonight, in front of 300 witnesses and one furious duke, she would finally answer it out loud. A single Latin word, carved in stone above a fireplace, was about to decide who owned an entire valley. Everyone in that ballroom believed the Duke had already won. Everyone except the quiet woman arranging roses by the window, who knew the carving did not say what he thought it said, and who was about to prove it in front of the one man who could ruin her for speaking at all. The candles at Sterling Manor were lit 2 hours before a single guest arrived, because Margaret Vance had learned that a room noticed early looks different than a room noticed late. She moved along the gallery with a basket of pale yellow roses, trimming each stem at an angle, setting them into a blue porcelain vase one at a time, and she did this slowly, the way she did everything now, because slowness let her listen. 6 years ago she would have been dancing in this gallery, not arranging flowers in it. Her father had been the estate's respected historian and the keeper of its oldest documents, a man other lords wrote letters to when they needed a phrase from an old charter explained. When he died, the money went with him, and so did the invitations. Margaret stayed on at Sterling Manor as a companion to the Duke's aging aunt, a position that fed her and sheltered her and asked her, in exchange, to be forgettable. She was very good at being forgettable. It was the only inheritance her father had left her that nobody could take away from his books. His careful mind, his habit of reading a document twice before believing a single word of it. The gallery smelled of beeswax polish and cut stems, and somewhere below stairs a footman was arguing quietly with a delivery boy about whether the ice for the punch had arrived early enough to still be useful by evening. Margaret found she liked these small, unremarkable sounds. They meant the day was still ordinary. She suspected, without quite knowing why, that it would not remain so for long. Lady Beatrice, the Duke's aunt, had asked her that morning to see that the roses matched the ones from the previous summer's gala, a request that meant nothing to anyone but mattered enormously to a woman who had buried a husband and outlived most of her friends and found comfort now only in small, exact repetitions. Margaret did not mind. She had grown fond of Lady Beatrice in a way she had not expected to grow fond of anyone in this house, and she suspected the fondness was returned, quietly, the way most things in this house were expressed. It had not always been this quiet a life. Margaret remembered, as a girl of 12, sitting at her father's elbow in this very manor's archive, before the previous Duke had died and everything after had changed so entirely. Her father had been given free use of the library in exchange for cataloging and preserving the estate's oldest documents, a post that had suited him perfectly, since he loved old parchment the way other men loved horses or cards. He had taught her Latin the way some fathers teach their daughters embroidery patiently, daily, treating her mind as though it deserved exactly the same cultivation a son would have received. She remembered him holding up a fragile page to the window light and telling her, more than once, that a language was only ever as honest as the person reading it, and that the honest reader's whole duty was to resist the temptation to make an old document say what was convenient, rather than what was true. When her father died suddenly, of a fever that took him in a fortnight, leaving behind more debts than either of them had realized existed, the new Duke's household had shown her a courtesy she had not expected, offering her a position as companion to Lady Beatrice rather than turning her out entirely. She had been grateful for it, in the practical way one is grateful for shelter during a storm, though she had also understood, from the very first week, that gratitude of that kind came with an unspoken condition. She was to be useful, quiet, and content to remain exactly where she had been placed. She had kept that unspoken bargain faithfully for 6 years. She wondered now, standing among the roses with the ballroom filling below her, how much longer she would have kept it. If the Duke himself had not stood beneath that motto and spoken a lie old enough to have outlived every honest man who might once have corrected it. Voices reached her from the far end of the corridor before their owners did. She recognized the clipped, businesslike tone of the estate solicitor first, and then the deeper voice underneath it, unhurried, certain of itself in the way that only a man who had never once been told no could sound. The tenants will be given until Michaelmas, the solicitor was saying. The charter gives your grace a clear title. There is no ambiguity in the wording. There had better not be, the Duke answered. My family did not build this house on ambiguity. There is a petition circulating in the lower valley, your grace. Some 40 signatures already. They claim an older right to the land that predates the current lease agreements. 40 signatures do not overturn 300 years of ownership. Draft the eviction notices. I want them ready before the gala, whether or not I choose to use them. Margaret kept her eyes on the roses. She had read that charter. She had read it 3 times in her father's study, in the small hours of the night, because the vicar's wife had asked her quietly, desperately, whether there was any hope at all for the families in the lower valley. Margaret had found something in the margin of that document that she did not yet fully understand. A scrawl of shorthand Latin so old it barely resembled the language anymore. She had not told anyone. Telling anyone meant admitting she still read Latin at all, and a companion who read dead languages better than her employer's own family was a companion who made people uneasy. Duke Julian Sterling passed close enough behind her that she felt the air move. He did not look at her. Nobody looked at her. That was the arrangement, and until tonight it had suited her perfectly. She noticed, in the brief instant he passed, that he carried himself the way a man carries a weight he has decided not to acknowledge in public. Shoulders set, jaw fixed, eyes fixed somewhere past the middle distance where no one could catch them and ask him anything difficult. She had seen him only a handful of times in 6 years, always from this same careful distance, always with the same quiet, private assessment she allowed herself because no one thought to guard against a companion's opinion. She had decided some years ago that he was not a cruel man. Careless, perhaps, certain of his own righteousness in the way most men raised to inherit everything were certain of it. But not cruel. She wondered, watching his back retreat down the corridor, whether careless men did more damage in the end than cruel ones, simply because no one thought to stop them in time. She set the last rose in place and allowed herself one small, private thought, the kind she never spoke aloud. Someone in this house is about to make a very old mistake, in front of everyone who matters, and I am the only person alive who will know it the moment he makes it. She told herself she would say nothing. She had told herself that before about smaller things, and had kept the promise every time. She believed it for almost 2 more hours. Lady Beatrice found her still in the gallery an hour before the first carriages were expected, moving slowly on her cane, her eyes sharp despite the slowness of the rest of her. "You are troubled," the old woman said. It was not a question. "I am only tired, my lady. You have never once lied to me convincingly, Margaret, in 6 years of trying." Lady Beatrice lowered herself into the window seat with the careful, practiced motion of a woman who had learned exactly how much her body would forgive her. "What is it?" Margaret hesitated, weighing the old habit of silence against the strange, sudden weight of the evening ahead. "I have read something, my lady, in an old document, something I do not think your nephew knows, and something I do not know how to say to him without it costing me a great deal." "Then say it to me first." "I am not certain it would be wise to say it to anyone." Lady Beatrice studied her for a long moment, the way she studied a hand of cards before deciding whether to fold it. "My dear," she said finally, "I have watched this family build a great deal of its fortune on things no one wished to say aloud. I have also watched it very nearly lose that fortune more than once because someone finally did. I cannot tell you which outcome tonight belongs to. I can only tell you that silence has never once, in my experience, been the safer choice it pretends to be. Margaret sat with her a while longer, watching the last of the afternoon light move slowly across the flagstones, before Lady Beatrice's maid arrived to help her dress for the evening. Left alone again, Margaret climbed to the small room she had occupied for 6 years, tucked beneath the eaves at the quiet end of the servants' corridor, and opened the single trunk that held everything of her father's she had kept. She did not need to search for the lexicon. Her hands found it in the dark, the leather worn soft at the corners from decades of use before it had ever come to her. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and opened it to the page she had marked weeks before, the entry for possession circled twice in her father's careful hand, with a small note beside it in ink gone brown with age. Context determines everything. A word is a servant to its century, never its master. She had read that note 100 times since his death, and it had never once felt as urgent as it did tonight, with a ballroom full of guests already arriving below and a motto waiting to be spoken that she alone, of everyone gathering in that house, understood to be wrong. She thought, briefly, of writing to the vicar's wife that very hour, warning her to attend the ball herself, to be present if anything at all should happen. She decided against it. There was no time, and she was not yet certain anything would happen beyond an ordinary evening of dancing and gossip. She dressed instead in her plainest gown, the same muted slate blue she wore to every gathering she was permitted to attend but never expected to be noticed at, and went down to the gallery to wait among the roses, telling herself, for perhaps the 10th time that day, that she intended to say nothing at all. Lady Beatrice's maid passed her on the stairs, arms full of ribbon and lace for the old woman's own gown, and paused just long enough to offer Margaret a small, knowing smile. "You look as though you are dressing for a funeral rather than a ball, Miss Vance." "I am only tired, as I told Lady Beatrice this afternoon. Mind you, eat something before the dancing begins." Then, "A tired mind makes poor decisions on an empty stomach," my mother always said, and I have found it to be true more often than not. The maid continued up the stairs, humming quietly to herself, entirely unaware of how precisely her small warning would come to matter before the evening was through. Margaret took the advice half-heartedly, eating a little bread and cold meat in the servants' hall before the guests arrived, though she found she had little appetite for it. Her mind kept returning, despite every effort to direct it elsewhere, to the carved motto above the fireplace and the quiet, damning correction she had spent 3 years refusing to speak aloud. By 9 o'clock the ballroom had filled with silk, candlelight, and the low hum of 300 conversations happening at once. Margaret stood near the tall windows, half hidden by a column, watching the way people arranged themselves according to rank without ever seeming to think about it. The highest families nearest the fire, the rest arranged outward like ripples in a pond. She recognized several faces from the lower valley among the servants carrying trays through the room, faces she had seen at the small chapel on Sundays, faces belonging to men whose names were almost certainly already written on the eviction notices the solicitor had been ordered to prepare. None of them looked up at the chandeliers or the silk. They kept their eyes on their trays, the particular carefulness of people who had learned that being noticed in this house rarely worked in their favor. Earlier that evening, before the first carriages had arrived, Margaret had overheard 2 of the younger housemaids discussing the eviction notices in the hallway outside the kitchens, their voices low and frightened. One of them had a brother in the lower valley, a tenant farmer with 3 children and a wife expecting a 4th, and she had spent the better part of the afternoon crying quietly into a stack of linens rather than let anyone see her distress plainly. Margaret had said nothing to her at the time, uncertain what comfort she could honestly offer, though the girl's tears had stayed with her all evening, a small, insistent weight beneath everything else she was trying not to think about. She thought of that girl now, watching the tenant footmen move silently between the guests, and felt the old caution in her chest give way, slowly, to something closer to resolve. Duke Julian climbed the 2 low steps at the head of the room, and the ballroom quieted the way a held breath quiets a chest. He was dressed simply for a man of his standing, a dark tailcoat, no ornament beyond the signet ring that had passed down 5 generations of Sterling men, and he carried himself the way Margaret imagined a fortress carries itself. Solid, indifferent to weather, built to outlast whatever stood in front of it. "Good evening," he said, and the room settled further, 300 people leaning slightly toward him without seeming to move at all. "Many of you have heard the rumors concerning the lower valley. I will settle them tonight, so that no one needs to whisper about it any further." He gestured up at the stone lintel above the great fireplace, where his family's motto had been carved 300 years earlier in careful Latin letters, worn soft at the edges by centuries of smoke. "Audaces fortuna, sed cautis possessio mane." "Fortune favors the bold," Julian said, translating it for the room as though he were doing them a courtesy. "But possession belongs to the careful. My family has held that land since the Charter of 1485. It is, and remains, entirely mine to do with as I see fit." A murmur of approval moved through the crowd, the particular murmur of people agreeing with a powerful man because agreeing with him is easier than the alternative. Somewhere near the back, Margaret saw one of the tenant footmen set down his tray a half-second too hard, the only visible sign that any of this mattered to him at all, before he caught himself and picked it back up. Margaret had heard this same motto recited before, at smaller gatherings over the years, always with the same confident translation, always accepted without question by a room that had no particular reason to doubt a duke's understanding of his own family's Latin. She had let it pass on those occasions, telling herself that a private suspicion was not the same thing as a proven fact, and that speaking without certainty would only cost her the little standing she had left. Tonight, with the eviction notices already drafted somewhere in the estate office and the tenant footmen carrying trays past a room that was about to applaud their ruin, she found she could no longer make that same bargain with herself. Margaret felt the shorthand in the margin surface in her memory the way a name surfaces when you have been trying not to think of it. Possessio, in that specific grammatical construction, in that specific century, in a legal charter rather than a poem, did not mean ownership at all. It meant custody, temporary, conditional, returned to its rightful stewards the instant the condition lapsed. She thought of the vicar's wife, of the quiet, careful way the woman had asked her question weeks earlier, as though she already expected the answer to be no. She thought of her father, of the countless evenings he had spent teaching her that a word out of place in a legal document was rarely an accident, and that the men who benefited from the mistake were rarely the ones who made it honestly. She told herself one final time to stay silent. Her feet did not listen. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be, because the room had already gone still enough to hear a pin land on the marble floor. "You have rendered possession as entitlement. In the charter your family cites, and in the century it was written, that word means custody, not ownership. Read correctly. The phrase restores the land to its original stewards the moment any sterling holder attempts to sell or seize it outright." The silence that followed did not sound like the polite silence of a pause between dances. It sounded like a held breath that had forgotten how to exhale. 300 faces turned toward the woman by the window, and for the first time in 6 years, nobody in that ballroom found Margaret Vance forgettable at all. A fan stopped mid-flutter somewhere to her left. A glass of punch, halfway to someone's mouth, hovered there instead, forgotten. Even the musicians, who had been tuning quietly in the corner in preparation for the first dance, went still, bows lifted and unmoving above their instruments. Margaret felt every eye in the room settle on her at once, and understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be useful, exactly what she had just done. For a long moment, no one moved at all. The candles guttered slightly in a draught from the tall windows, and somewhere far off in the kitchens a dropped tray clattered against stone, the sound absurdly loud in a room that had gone otherwise silent. Margaret felt her pulse in her throat, in her wrists, in the soles of her feet where they pressed against the marble floor as though the ground itself might decide, in the next instant, whether to hold her weight or not. She thought, in that endless second, of every reason she had given herself over 6 years for staying quiet. The fear of Lady Beatrice's disapproval, unfounded as it turned out to be. The fear of losing her small room beneath the eaves, her modest wage, the only roof she had left since her father's debts had claimed the cottage she was born in. The fear, deeper than any of the others, of being looked at again, truly looked at, the way a person is looked at when they have made themselves impossible to ignore, rather than the polite, passing glance a companion earns simply for existing in a room she has been told to keep tidy. All of it, every careful year of it, had ended the moment she opened her mouth, and there was no way now to close it again. Duke Julian did not raise his voice, which somehow made the moment worse for everyone watching. He simply turned, found her among the crowd, and looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door he has just discovered has been unlocked the entire time. "You will forgive me," he said, in a tone pitched for the whole room to hear, "if I ask which university granted a lady's companion a degree in medieval law." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the guests, the kind that comes from people who do not yet know whose side to take. Margaret felt her face grow warm, felt every old fear about being seen rise up at once, and she made herself hold perfectly still rather than let it show. "No university, Your Grace," she said. "Only my father's library, and a great deal of quiet reading." "Then perhaps your father's library made an error." "Perhaps," Margaret allowed. "I would welcome the chance to be wrong. I would welcome it a great deal more than I welcome watching families lose their homes over a mistranslation." A woman near the front, one of the county's oldest and most opinionated matrons, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something behind a fan, loud enough that fragments of it carried, "Companion, presumption, who does she imagine herself to be?" Margaret kept her chin level and did not let herself look for the source of the whisper. She had learned, long before tonight, that turning to face every unkind word only fed it. Something shifted behind the Duke's eyes, quick and unreadable, gone before anyone else could have caught it. He inclined his head, just barely, and the orchestra, sensing that the moment needed rescuing far more urgently than the guests needed an explanation, struck up a quadrille. Conversation swallowed the silence whole, the way a pond closes over a dropped stone, and within a minute the ballroom looked exactly as it had an hour before, except that everyone in it was now watching Margaret Vance out of the corners of their eyes. She slipped out through the side corridor before the dance finished, needing air, needing the cold stone quiet of the East Gallery where the sunlight had already given way to a pale, early moon through the tall windows. She had barely reached the second window when she heard his footsteps behind her. An unhurried, deliberate man who never needed to walk quickly because rooms simply waited for him. "Miss Vance." He said her name as though testing whether it belonged to her at all. "Who taught you Latin well enough to correct a peer of the realm at his own ball?" "My father, Your Grace. He kept the archive here for the previous Duke before your time. He believed a document should be understood before it is obeyed." "And you believe the same?" "I believe a lie carved in stone is still a lie, however old the stone is." Julian studied her for a long moment, the way she imagined he studied a horse before deciding whether to trust it with his weight. "Do you understand what you have just done, Miss Vance? In one sentence, you have given 40 tenant families a reason to believe their claim is stronger than mine. You have given my political rivals a story they will repeat at every dinner table in the county for a decade. And you have done it as a woman with no fortune, no family name of consequence, and no protection beyond whatever goodwill my aunt happens to feel toward you on any given morning. I am aware of the cost, Your Grace. I considered it for a long moment before I spoke. And spoke anyway. Yes. Why?" Margaret held his gaze, refusing to let the question shrink her the way it was clearly meant to. "Because I have spent 6 years in this house being told, in 100 quiet ways, that my silence was worth more than my honesty. I decided tonight that I disagreed." Julian was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Margaret began to wonder whether she had, after all, said too much. "If you are right," he said finally, "you have just told an entire ballroom that I do not own what I have spent my whole life believing I owned. If you are wrong, you have humiliated me in front of every family whose good opinion keeps this estate solvent. Either way, Miss Vance, I intend to find out which it is tonight in my library, where there are no witnesses to embarrass either of us further. And if I refuse, Your Grace, then I will have my answer regardless, Miss Vance, and considerably less patience left over for finding it kindly." Before he had followed her into the gallery, Margaret had stood alone by the window for several minutes, listening to the muffled music resume behind the closed doors, turning the whole of the evening over in her mind. She had expected, if she expected anything at all, to be summoned before Lady Beatrice, or quietly dismissed by morning, sent back to whatever small cottage a companion's modest savings could still afford her. She had not expected the Duke himself to follow her, alone, without a single witness to soften whatever he intended to say. She thought, watching the moon climb higher over the dark hedges beyond the glass, of her father's voice, patient and certain, telling her that the truth rarely arrives at a convenient hour, and that the measure of a person's character was not whether they recognized it, but whether they were willing to speak it once they had. Margaret allowed herself a moment to look at him properly, perhaps for the first time in 6 years. Not the Duke glimpsed from a careful distance across a ballroom, but the man standing in front of her now, jaw tight, eyes uncertain in a way she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to witness. "You are angry," she said. "I am many things tonight, Miss Vance. Angry is only the simplest of them to name. What are the others?" He did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its earlier command. "Uncertain. I have spent my entire life being told what this family owns, what it is owed, what it has always been entitled to since long before I was born to inherit it. I do not enjoy discovering, in front of 300 witnesses, that perhaps none of that was ever as settled as I believed." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, softened, though he seemed almost annoyed at himself for allowing it. "And curious, which surprises me more than the other two combined." "Curious about what, Your Grace?" "About how a woman in my own household who spent 6 years training to disappear came to know more about my family's history than I do." Margaret held his gaze without flinching, though her heart had not yet slowed from the ballroom. "Then let us go and find out together, Your Grace, before curiosity turns back into anger and decides I am easier to blame than the document is." A faint, reluctant smile crossed his face at that, the first she had seen from him all evening that did not carry some trace of wounded pride behind it. "You are considerably braver than 6 years of silence led me to expect, Miss Vance. I have had a great deal of practice being brave quietly, Your Grace. Tonight is only the first time I have practiced it loudly." He offered his arm, an oddly formal gesture given the circumstances, and Margaret took it, aware of the strangeness of walking beside a duke through his own darkened corridors toward a conversation that would very likely determine the whole shape of both their futures. Neither of them spoke as they walked, though the silence between them felt different than the silence that had followed her in the ballroom only minutes before, less an absence of words than a shared understanding that whatever came next deserved to be met carefully, rather than filled with nervous conversation for its own sake. Margaret found, to her quiet surprise, that she did not dread the library the way she had dreaded the ballroom stairs. She had spent enough evenings alone among those shelves to think of the room almost as a second home, and some small, steadying part of her hoped that familiarity might carry her through whatever the Duke intended to ask of her once they arrived. The estate library at Sterling Manor held more books than most universities, shelved floor to ceiling in oak cases that smelled of leather and beeswax and centuries of careful dust. Margaret had spent countless quiet afternoons here cataloging for the Duke's aunt. Always alone, always unremarked. Tonight, for the first time, Julian walked in beside her, and the room felt entirely different with him in it. He set the original 1485 charter on the reading table himself rather than summoning a servant to fetch it, which told her something about him she had not expected. He wanted, apparently, to see the parchment with his own eyes before he decided what to believe about it. "You keep this locked," Margaret observed, watching him work the small brass key from a chain at his waistcoat. "My father kept it locked. I have never once had cause to open the case myself." He said it without embarrassment, though Margaret thought she heard, underneath the words, the faint discomfort of a man realizing how much of his own legacy he had simply accepted rather than examined. Margaret unrolled the charter with the careful reverence her father had taught her, weighting the corners with smooth river stones kept for exactly this purpose. The Latin ran in tight, formal script down the length of the page, the hand of a 15th-century clerk who had clearly been paid by the letter and resented every one of them. "Here," she said, tracing a line without touching the ink. "Possessio Mane, donec hers virus redditor." Possession remains with the careful custodian until the true heir is restored. It is a conditional clause, Your Grace, not a grant. The motto above your fireplace is an abbreviation of a shortened, decorative version carved centuries later by someone who either misunderstood the original condition or chose not to include it. Julian leaned over the parchment, closer to her than strict propriety allowed, close enough that she could see the tight, controlled focus in his face replace the arrogance he wore in ballrooms. "Read it again." Slowly. She did, tracing each word with her finger held just above the ink, and watched him mouth the Latin silently along with her, the way a man mouths a language he half remembers from a tutor he resented as a boy. "You are certain. I have read this document more times than I can count, because a woman in the lower valley asked me, quietly, whether her family had any hope. I did not tell her yes. I did not know enough to tell her anything, until tonight, when your own recitation forced me to say it aloud. You have been reading my family's private charter for how long? Since before my father died, Your Grace. He and I read it together. He never told anyone what he found, because he believed the previous duke would simply burn it rather than honor it." Julian's expression cooled at that, though not, Margaret thought, at her. "My father was not a gentleman where money was concerned," he said. "It would not surprise me if he buried a truth that cost him land." He straightened, and for a moment the fortress in him seemed to crack just enough to let something more uncertain through. "If this is true, Miss Vance, I am not merely wrong about a translation. I am the 4th generation of my family to enforce a lie without knowing it was one. Or," Margaret said carefully, "the 4th generation to be lied to by someone closer to you than any Latin scholar ever was." Julian looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time all evening, he did not look like a duke defending his fortune. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath his family's entire legacy might not be as solid as the stone it was carved into. "Sit," he said finally, drawing a second chair to the reading table without quite meeting her eyes, as though the request embarrassed him more than the charter did. "If we are to spend the night proving me wrong, Miss Vance, I would rather do it properly than standing over a table like a man interrogating a servant." They worked until well past midnight, the candles burning low, Julian reading each line back to her in halting, half-remembered Latin while Margaret corrected him gently, without condescension, the way her father had once corrected her. She found, somewhere in the third hour, that she had stopped bracing for his temper and started, instead, simply enjoying the work, the particular pleasure of watching a clever mind catch up to a fact it had been resisting. "You could have told my aunt," Julian said at one point, apropos of nothing, staring at the parchment rather than at her, "or the vicar, or written to a solicitor in the city. Any of them might have carried this forward without exposing you at all. I considered it. Why did you not?" Margaret considered her answer carefully before giving it. "Because a letter can be lost, Your Grace, or ignored, or quietly bought. A room full of witnesses is harder to make disappear." She looked up and found him already watching her. "I did not plan to speak tonight. I had told myself every day for 3 years that I would not. But you stood beneath that motto and said it so plainly, so certainly, that I understood no one else in that room was ever going to correct you. I decided I would rather be the inconvenient woman who spoke than the comfortable one who watched a lie become law because she was too careful to stop it." Julian did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost most of its earlier edge. "I have been Duke for 2 years, Miss Vance. In that time I have signed a great many documents I did not read as carefully as I should have, trusting men I had known my whole life to have read them for me. Tonight is the first time anyone has shown me, plainly, what that trust has cost people who had no voice to object to it." He met her eyes. "I find I owe you considerably more gratitude than my behavior in that ballroom suggested. You owe the tenants your attention far more than you owe me your gratitude, Your Grace. I intend to give them both in time, but allow me this evening to give the gratitude to the person who earned it directly." He studied her for a long moment across the candlelight, in a way that made Margaret suddenly and acutely aware of how close their 2 chairs had drawn together over the course of the night's work, though neither of them had moved them deliberately. "May I ask you something that has nothing to do with the charter, Miss Vance?" "You may ask, Your Grace. I cannot promise an answer that satisfies you." "Why flowers? I have watched you these 6 years, arranging roses in that gallery before every gathering this house has held, and I confess I never once wondered why until tonight." Margaret considered the question longer than its simplicity seemed to warrant. "My mother kept a small garden before she died. I do not remember her well, only fragments of her hands in the soil, the particular yellow of the roses she preferred above every other color. Arranging flowers is the closest thing I have left to a memory of her. It also," she added, with the faint trace of a smile she rarely allowed herself in this house, "gives a companion an excuse to stand quietly in a corner of a room, watching everyone else, without anyone thinking to ask her opinion of what she sees." "And what have 6 years of watching taught you, Miss Vance?" "That the people who speak loudest in a ballroom are rarely the ones worth listening to, Your Grace, and that the quietest people in the room are usually the ones who understand it best." Julian smiled at that, briefly but genuinely, and Margaret found herself unexpectedly reluctant for the evening's work to end. It occurred to her, watching him gather the loose pages of his own careful notes into some semblance of order, that she had spent 6 years believing herself invisible in this house, and that somewhere over the course of a single long night, that belief had quietly stopped being true. She was not certain, sitting there in the low candlelight with the old charter still open between them, whether that change frightened her or steadied her more. She suspected, before the fortnight was through, she would come to understand it as both. By the following afternoon, the story of the companion who had corrected the Duke's Latin had traveled through every parlor within 10 miles, gathering embellishments the way a snowball gathers snow. In one version, Margaret had been a secret governess to a bishop's children. In another, she had studied at a convent in France under a false name. In a third, whispered mostly by the young and unmarried, she had bewitched the Duke entirely, and the correction had merely been her opening gambit. The truth that she was simply the daughter of a careful, honest man who had taught her to read apparently made for a duller story than the ones people preferred to invent. Margaret bore the whispers as best she could, keeping to the aunt's private sitting room and the walled garden, though she noticed the housemaids grew quieter around her, and one of the younger footmen would not quite meet her eyes when he passed her in the corridor, as though uncertain whether he was meant to treat her as a companion still, or as something else entirely that he had no name for. Lady Beatrice, for her part, seemed to find the entire episode enormously satisfying. "I have not seen this county this thoroughly rattled since the harvest failure of '11, she said over breakfast, buttering her toast with visible relish. "You have done this family more good than you know, my dear, whatever my nephew's uncle happens to think of it." "I do not believe Lord George shares your enthusiasm, my lady." "Lord George," Lady Beatrice said, setting down her knife with unusual precision, "has never once in his life shared enthusiasm for anything that did not directly enrich him. I would be very careful of that man, Margaret, if I were you. He smiles the way a fox smiles at a henhouse it has not yet found a way into." Margaret found the warning had come only a few hours too late. Lord George Sterling, the Duke's uncle, a silver-tongued man whose waistcoats were always a season ahead of everyone else's, found her among the roses that same afternoon with the particular smile of a man who has already decided how a conversation will end. "Miss Vance." He bowed with more flourish than necessary. "A remarkable performance last evening. Truly, I have rarely seen a room so thoroughly rearranged by a single sentence." "It was not a performance, my lord. It was a translation." Of course, of course." He walked a slow circle around the rose bed, the way a man circles something he intends to purchase. "You must understand the position this places my nephew in. A duke cannot be seen second-guessing his own family motto on the word of a lady's companion, however learned. It would be so much simpler for everyone, yourself included, if you were to recall the evening a little differently. A misunderstanding, perhaps. A joke that traveled further than intended." "I did not misunderstand a 15th-century legal document, my lord." No, his smile did not move, though something behind his eyes did. "But you could be persuaded to say that you did. I am prepared to be generous. A cottage of your own, an income sufficient for a companion's comfortable retirement, far from Sterling land, far from any further temptation to correct anyone's Latin ever again. You are asking me to leave this house. I am asking you to accept a very comfortable life somewhere quieter, Miss Vance, in exchange for a small favor that costs you nothing you have not already said too loudly once." Margaret set down her shears with deliberate care, because her hands wanted to shake and she refused to let them. "You are offering to pay me to lie. I am offering to pay you to forget an inconvenience. There is a difference if you look at it correctly." "I have looked at a great many documents very correctly, my lord. This is the first time I have ever been offered money to look away from one." She met his gaze without flinching, though every instinct she owned told her this was a dangerous man to refuse. I will not take your cottage, and I will not unlearn what I read last night. Lord George's smile finally faded into something colder, something that looked, for just a moment, like the version of him that existed when no audience was watching. You are a very stubborn woman for someone with so little to protect her. I have my father's name, my lord, and my own conscience. I have found, in my experience, that they protect me a great deal further than money protects the men who offer it. Then I hope, Miss Vance, that you are as certain of your Latin as you appear to be, because if you are wrong, no one in this county will lift a finger to protect you. And if you are right, he paused, letting the unfinished sentence do its own work. You have made yourself a very inconvenient woman to a family with a great deal of money and considerably more patience than kindness. He left her among the roses, and for the first time since the ball, Margaret allowed herself to feel afraid. She stood there a long while after his footsteps had faded, turning his words over the way she turned over difficult Latin, looking for the exact shape of the threat hidden inside the courtesy. She did not find comfort in the answer. That night, alone in her small room beneath the eaves, she lit a single candle and sat for a long while with her father's lexicon open on her lap, though she was not reading it, only holding it the way one holds something solid when everything else feels uncertain. She thought of the cottage Lord George had offered her, of how easy it would be to accept it, to disappear quietly to some distant parish where no one had ever heard the story of the companion who corrected a duke, and to live out a small, safe, forgettable life exactly as she had been trained to for 6 years. She thought, too, of the vicar's wife's quiet question weeks earlier, of the housemaid crying into the linens over her brother's eviction notice, of every tenant family in the lower valley who had no lexicon of their own, no father who had taught them to read a 15th-century charter, no voice loud enough to be heard in a ballroom even if they had found the courage to raise it. She was, she realized, perhaps the only person in the county who could read that codicil correctly and who might also be believed if she spoke it aloud a second time. She closed the lexicon, blew out the candle, and did not sleep well, but she did not, in the end, write the letter of acceptance that some small, tired part of her had considered drafting. By morning, the fear had not left her entirely, but it had settled into something she could carry rather than something that carried her. That evening she wrote a short letter to the vicar's wife, the woman who had first asked her the quiet question that had started all of this, warning her, gently, to be careful of any strangers asking after the tenant petition in the coming days. She did not sign it with her full name. Old habits, she found, did not disappear simply because she had finally decided to stop hiding behind them. She walked to the chapel herself 2 days later, using the excuse of a delivery of hymnals that Lady Beatrice had genuinely asked her to arrange, and found the vicar's wife, Mrs. Aldridge, kneeling in the small garden behind the rectory, pulling weeds from around a row of new cabbages with the brisk efficiency of a woman who did not believe in wasted motion. "You are the talk of 3 parishes," Mrs. Aldridge said, without looking up. "I have had no fewer than 6 women stop me after service to ask whether I knew you were a scholar. I am not a scholar, Mrs. Aldridge. I am simply someone who was taught to read carefully. That is precisely what a scholar is, my dear, whatever modesty tells you to call it instead." She sat back on her heels and studied Margaret properly for the first time. "You look tired and frightened, though you are hiding it well. Lord George offered me money to recant what I said at the ball. And did you take it?" "No." "Good. I would have been very disappointed in you, though I confess I would have understood the temptation. Men like that count on people being tired enough and frightened enough to accept whatever price makes the fear go away." She rose, brushing the dirt from her skirts, and took both of Margaret's hands in hers, an unusually warm gesture for a woman Margaret had always known to be somewhat reserved. "Whatever comes of this, Margaret Vance, the families in that valley will not forget what you did for them at that ball. whether the Duke corrects the matter properly or not. That is worth more than any cottage Lord George could offer you. I hope you are right, Mrs. Aldrich. I confess I have found it difficult, these past few days, to feel as certain of that as I would like. Certainty is a luxury, my dear, that very few of us are given before the fact. It is usually granted only afterward, once the frightening part is already behind us. Mrs. Aldrich walked her back toward the rectory gate. The late afternoon light gold and low across the cabbage rows. Go home. Rest if you are able. And remember that whatever Lord George threatens, he is only one man, and you have already proven yourself considerably more formidable than he expected. She told Julian about his uncle's visit the following morning, in the library, over the same charter that had not left the reading table since the night she had unrolled it. She expected anger. She received, instead, a long silence and then a single question. What exactly did he offer you? A cottage, an income, silence, dressed up as generosity. Julian's jaw tightened. My uncle has managed this estate's finances since my father's death, while I was still learning which fields belonged to which tenant. I trusted him because I had no reason not to. I am beginning to think that trust was the most expensive mistake of my life. There is a way to test it, Margaret said. If you are willing to look at something I found in the margin of the charter last night, after you had gone to bed. She turned the parchment gently toward the pale morning light and showed him the edge of the page, where a second hand cramped, hurried, almost illegible had added a short passage in a shorthand Latin so abbreviated it barely resembled the language at all. It had taken her 3 hours and her father's rare private lexicon to work through it letter by letter. It is a codicil, she said, added perhaps 50 years after the original charter by a different clerk in a different ink. It names a second family, the Vance family, your grace as joint stewards of the valley, with the explicit right to consent or refuse any sale of the land. Whoever added this clause believed the original stewardship needed a witness who could not be bribed or intimidated by a single duke's household. Julian read the passage twice, his lips moving slightly over the difficult shorthand, and when he finally looked up his face had gone the color of old parchment itself. Vance, he repeated. Your family name. My father's family, yes. I did not know this existed until last night. I do not know why he never told me, unless he did not fully understand it himself, or unless he was protecting me from exactly the conversation we are having now. If this codicil is genuine, Julian said slowly, then my family has not merely misquoted a motto. We have spent 3 generations selling and seizing land we never had sole authority to touch. Without the consent of a family we systematically reduced to servitude in our own house. He looked at her, and something in his expression had shifted entirely from suspicion into something closer to shame. I owe you an apology I do not know how to give properly, Miss Vance. You owe the tenants in the lower valley considerably more than an apology, Your Grace. An apology is only the beginning. He nodded slowly, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of the discovery settling over the room the way dust settles over a shelf no one has disturbed in years. Julian sat down heavily in the chair beside her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, both watching the candlelight move across the old parchment as though it might, given enough silence, offer some further explanation neither of them had yet found. I keep returning to the same question, he said finally. If my family has held this land unlawfully for 3 generations, why did your father never bring the matter forward himself, while he still held the archive and the standing to be believed? I have asked myself the same question more than once since last night, Your Grace. I believe he did not fully understand what he had found. The shorthand is difficult even for a trained eye, and my father's health failed quickly in the end, before he had the leisure to work through it as thoroughly as I have these past 2 days. Or perhaps he understood it well enough, and feared exactly what had happened to me this week. The previous Duke's temper was, by every account I have heard, considerably less patient than yours. You are being generous to my patience, Miss Vance, given how little of it I displayed at the ball. You displayed astonishment, Your Grace, which is not the same failing. A man who reacts to a shock with anger, and then sets the anger aside to examine the shock honestly has considerably more patience than most of the county credits him with. Julian was quiet for a long moment, turning the implications of the codicil over with the same careful attention Margaret had watched him bring to every page of the archive that week. If your family holds joint stewardship, Miss Vance, then your father's dismissal from this house after his own father's death was not merely a matter of reduced fortune. It may have been a deliberate effort to remove the one family with legal standing to challenge my grandfather's decisions. I have wondered the same thing these past 2 days, Your Grace, though I have no proof of it beyond suspicion. My father was given no formal notice, only a quiet suggestion, delivered by a solicitor, that his services were no longer required now that the estate's records were considered complete. He accepted it without complaint, as he accepted most things, and never once suggested to me that there might have been a deeper reason behind it. Do you believe he knew? Margaret considered this carefully, unwilling to claim a certainty she did not honestly possess. I believe he suspected something, Your Grace, though whether he understood the full shape of it, I cannot say. He kept this lexicon locked in his own trunk rather than in the estate archive, which was unusual for a man who otherwise kept every reference book he owned on open shelves for anyone to consult. I have wondered, since finding the codicil, whether that was a deliberate choice on his part, keeping the one tool capable of unlocking this secret somewhere your family could not simply confiscate along with everything else. Then he protected this family's claim without ever quite protecting his own daughter's knowledge of it. Perhaps he believed the two could not be separated, Your Grace. Perhaps he believed that the day I finally understood what I held, I would also understand the danger of holding it too loudly, too soon, before I had the standing or the certainty to make it matter. Margaret looked down at the old parchment, then back at him. I began to think he was right to worry. I have felt that danger a great deal these past 2 weeks. There is something else, Margaret said finally. The ink on the codicil is not uniform. 2 hands wrote it, I think the original edition, and a second attempt to reinforce or perhaps repair a portion of it, decades later still. Someone else knew about this clause long after the original clerk died. Someone who cared enough to preserve it, rather than destroy it. My grandfather kept a private steward, Julian said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke. A man named Whitlock, dismissed suddenly when I was a boy, under circumstances no one in the family ever explained to me. I always assumed some minor scandal. Debt, perhaps, or drink. Or perhaps a man who found something in this archive that someone else did not wish preserved. Julian looked at her sharply. You believe my family dismissed him for finding this? I believe it is worth asking, Your Grace, before we assume the worst of your uncle without a single fact beyond a bribe and a bad feeling. Margaret closed the lexicon gently. My father taught me never to accuse a man of forgery until I had proven the forgery existed. Suspicion is not evidence. It only tells us where to look for it. Julian was quiet for a long moment, turning the implications of the codicil over with the same careful attention Margaret had watched him bring to every page of the archive that week. If your family holds joint stewardship, Miss Vance, then your father's dismissal from this house after his own father's death was not merely a matter of reduced fortune. It may have been a deliberate effort to remove the one family with legal standing to challenge my grandfather's decisions. I have wondered the same thing these past 2 days, Your Grace, though I have no proof of it beyond suspicion. My father was given no formal notice, only a quiet suggestion, delivered by a solicitor, that his services were no longer required now that the estate's records were considered complete. He accepted it without complaint, as he accepted most things, and never once suggested to me that there might have been a deeper reason behind it. Do you believe he knew? Margaret considered this carefully, unwilling to claim a certainty she did not honestly possess. I believe he suspected something, Your Grace, though whether he understood the full shape of it, I cannot say. He kept this lexicon locked in his own trunk rather than in the estate archive, which was unusual for a man who otherwise kept every reference book he owned on open shelves for anyone to consult. I have wondered, since finding the codicil, whether that was a deliberate choice on his part, keeping the one tool capable of unlocking this secret somewhere your family could not simply confiscate along with everything else. Then he protected this family's claim without ever quite protecting his own daughter's knowledge of it. Perhaps he believed the two could not be separated, Your Grace. Perhaps he believed that the day I finally understood what I held, I would also understand the danger of holding it too loudly, too soon, before I had the standing or the certainty to make it matter. Margaret looked down at the old parchment, then back at him. I began to think he was right to worry. I have felt that danger a great deal these past 2 weeks. Then we will look, Julian said, and something in his voice had steadied, as though the decision itself had settled something in him that the discovery alone had not. Together, if you are willing. I do not trust myself to read this correctly without you, Miss Vance, and I find I have grown considerably less interested in pretending otherwise. Margaret spent that evening writing to the neighboring parish where Whitlock, the dismissed steward, was rumored to have settled after his departure from Sterling land. She addressed the letter carefully, revealing as little as possible of what she already suspected, asking only whether a Mr. Whitlock still resided there, and whether he might be willing to correspond with the current Duke's household regarding a matter of historical record. She did not expect a swift reply, and did not receive one immediately, which left her the better part of a week to sit with the growing unease that Lord George's warning had planted in her. She found herself watching the corridors more carefully than she had in years, listening for footsteps that lingered too long outside doors, noticing which servants avoided her eyes and which now, cautiously, sought them out. Lady Beatrice noticed the change in her, as she noticed most things. You are watching this house the way a woman watches a house she no longer trusts, she observed one evening, over a quiet game of cards neither of them was paying proper attention to. I am uncertain how much of it to trust, my lady, until we know what Lord George is prepared to do. My nephew's uncle, Lady Beatrice said, setting down a card with more force than the game required, has always been the kind of man who mistakes charm for goodness, and mistakes other people's patience for permission. I do not think he will do anything so crude as harm you outright, Margaret. He is too careful a man for that, and too concerned with his own reputation. But careful men have a way of finding other means when the direct one fails them. Keep your letters close, and trust very few people with your plans until the night itself. Margaret took the advice seriously, and told no one else in the house, beyond Julian, precisely what she and he had discovered, or what they intended to do with it. I need to tell you something, Julian said, 3 nights later, when Margaret found him still awake in the library, a single candle burning low beside a stack of estate ledgers he had clearly been reading for hours. I did not recite that motto at the ball by accident. Margaret set down the book she had been carrying. Explain. For the better part of a year, my estate office has received anonymous letters, mostly pointing out errors in tenant contracts, small mistranslations in old agreements, always signed with nothing but a single initial. I could never discover who sent them. I began to suspect the writer knew this house's archive better than I did, better perhaps than anyone alive. He met her eyes across the candlelight. I recited that motto publicly, incorrectly, on purpose. I wanted to see who in that ballroom could not stop themselves from correcting me. Margaret felt something cold move through her, followed almost immediately by something that was not quite anger. You baited me, in front of 300 people, knowing full well what it might cost me if I answered. I did not know it would be you, Julian said quietly. I want you to believe that, at least, I suspected a scholar, a solicitor, perhaps a rival family's tutor. I did not expect the letters to have come from a woman my own household had spent 6 years training to be invisible. And now that you know? Now I know my uncle has been managing contracts he had no legal right to manage alone, using a motto he either forged or deliberately mistranslated, while systematically pricing out every family whose land might one day be worth more than the rent it currently paid him. And I know the only person who caught it was a woman he tried to bribe into silence within a single day of the ball. Julian stood, crossing the room until he stood close enough that Margaret had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze. I am asking you to help me finish what your letters started, Miss Vance. Not quietly this time, in front of the same 300 witnesses who watched you correct me. At the Solstice Gala in 10 days. Your uncle will not simply confess because you ask him to. No. Which is why I need you to read the codicil aloud, in front of the entire county, before he has any chance to make it disappear the way he has clearly made other documents disappear before. Margaret considered this for a long moment, weighing every danger she could name against the greater one of doing nothing. If we do this, Your Grace, we must be exact. One error, one uncertain word, and your uncle will make the entire charter look like a fiction I invented to secure myself a fortune. I will not stand in front of 300 people again without being absolutely certain of every syllable. Then we will be certain, Julian said. Together. Over the following days they worked through every surviving page of the estate's oldest records, cross-referencing the codicil shorthand against 3 other documents from the same decades, until Margaret could recite the disputed passage without a single hesitation, and Julian, to her quiet surprise, had learned enough of the grammar himself to follow her reasoning without needing it explained twice. They spoke, in those hours, of things that had nothing to do with charters at all. Her father's habit of reading aloud to her by firelight, his own boyhood spent memorizing ledgers his tutors insisted would matter more to him one day than poetry ever would. She found herself, more than once, laughing at something he said before she had quite decided whether laughing was appropriate given the circumstances. It was near 2 in the morning, some 5 nights before the gala, when Julian finally set down the last ledger and rubbed at his eyes with the heel of his hand, the gesture of a man who had forgotten, for several hours, that he was tired at all. You should sleep, Your Grace, Margaret said, gathering the loose pages of her own transcription into a neat stack. The charter will still say the same thing in the morning, whatever else changes before then. I find I do not want to leave it, he admitted, as though the moment I stop looking at it, it might quietly become the version my uncle prefers again. He glanced at her, something almost sheepish in the admission. That is an irrational fear, I am aware. It is not so irrational, Your Grace. I have felt something very like it myself, more nights than I would care to admit, wondering whether a truth I had found by candlelight would still exist by morning, or whether I had only imagined it because I wanted so badly for it to be there. And was it always there in the morning? Always, Margaret said, though I confess I did not always trust myself enough to look again right away. Julian was quiet for a moment, watching her across the candlelight in a way that made her feel, for the first time all evening, entirely seen rather than merely observed. Thank you, he said finally, not for the translation alone, though I am grateful for that. For staying in this room past the point when it would have been easier to leave and let me discover the rest of it on my own. I do not think you would have discovered it alone, Your Grace. Forgive my bluntness. A brief, tired smile crossed his face, the first she had seen from him that did not carry the weight of a ballroom behind it. No, he agreed. I do not think I would have. You are not at all what the county believes you to be, Julian observed a few evenings later, watching her work through a particularly stubborn passage of shorthand by candlelight. No, Margaret agreed. Nor, I begin to suspect, are you? I have been thinking, Julian said, some nights later, as they walked the length of the gallery together after another long evening in the archive, about what happens to you, Miss Vance, once the gala has passed, whatever the outcome. My uncle will not forgive this easily, win or lose. You will need protection this house has not always thought to offer you. I have survived 6 years in this house without much protection, Your Grace. I do not intend to stop managing my own account now. I am not suggesting you cannot manage. I am suggesting you should not have to, not any longer, and not on my account only. He stopped walking, and Margaret stopped beside him, the moonlight falling through the tall windows in long silver bars across the floor between them. I find myself thinking of you at hours that have nothing to do with charters, Miss Vance. I am not certain what to make of that, given everything else this fortnight has required of both of us, but I did not wish to reach the gala without having said it plainly, at least once, in case the evening goes badly for either of us. Margaret felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately trust herself to name. You are a duke, Your Grace, and I am a companion with a disputed claim to a valley neither of us is yet certain belongs to my family at all. This is not a simple thing you are describing. No, he agreed. It is not simple in the least. I have found, this fortnight, that I no longer have much patience for the simple things this family used to prefer instead. She did not answer him directly, not that night, though she found she carried the conversation with her afterward the way she carried a difficult passage of Latin, turning it over in quiet moments, testing it against what she already knew to be true, and finding each time that it held. He held out his hand, not quite touching hers, an invitation rather than a demand. I cannot do this without you. I would not trust the outcome to anyone else. Margaret looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, weighing the danger of trusting a duke against the greater danger of doing nothing at all. Then she took it. The 10 days before the solstice gala passed with a strange, deliberate quiet, both of them going about the ordinary business of the house as though nothing at all had changed, while beneath the surface every ledger, every letter, every witness who might confirm or deny a piece of the puzzle was being quietly gathered. Julian sent riders to the neighboring parish to confirm the dismissal date of the steward Whitlock. Margaret wrote, carefully and without her name, to the vicar's wife, asking her to gather any tenant families willing to stand at the back of the ballroom on the night of the gala, not to speak, only to be seen. Lord George, for his part, seemed entirely unaware that anything had shifted. He continued to manage the estate's correspondence with his usual polished confidence, continued to smile at Margaret in the corridors as though their conversation among the roses had never happened, and continued, Julian's own investigation confirmed, to correspond privately with a printer in the city known for producing convincing reproductions of old documents for collectors who preferred not to ask too many questions. Whitlock's reply arrived 4 days before the gala, carried by a writer Julian had sent personally rather than trust to the ordinary post. The former steward, now an old man living quietly on a small pension in the neighboring county, agreed to sign a statement confirming what Margaret had already suspected, that he had discovered the codicil some 15 years earlier while cataloging the estate archive for the previous duke, and had been quietly paid a settlement to leave his position without ever mentioning what he had found. He says he kept a copy, Julian told her, reading the letter aloud in the library by the last of the evening light, in case it was ever needed. He says he has waited 15 years for someone in this house to ask him the right question. Then we must be certain we ask it properly, Your Grace, and do not waste the 15 years he has already spent waiting. The night before the gala, neither of them slept much. Margaret sat up rehearsing the disputed passage until she could recite it in her sleep, and Julian, she learned the following morning, had spent the same hours drafting and redrafting the words he intended to say to the assembled lords, discarding each version as either too harsh toward his own family name or too gentle toward the truth the evening required. "I keep wanting to soften it," he admitted, when she found him at breakfast looking as though he had not touched his food at all. "For my father's memory, if nothing else. And then I remember the tenant families who have had no softening extended to them in 3 generations, and I discard the gentler version again. Then trust the harder version, Your Grace. Kindness to the dead has never once fed a family that was hungry because of them." Lord George, unaware of how thoroughly his own scheme had already unraveled, spent those same final days in quiet satisfaction, certain that his forged parchment would settle the matter cleanly, once and for all, before his nephew had time to gather any credible resistance. He met privately with the city printer one final time, 3 days before the gala, to confirm the aging of the ink had dried convincingly and that no untrained eye would find fault with it. "It will pass any examination a country lord could offer," the printer assured him, wrapping the parchment carefully in oiled cloth. "Provided, of course, no one thinks to compare it against the genuine article." "No one has seen the genuine article in a generation," George said, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been contradicted successfully. "My brother kept it locked away and told no one the combination but myself. My nephew has neither the patience nor the interest to go looking for it now." He did not know, as he said it, that the genuine article had already been unlocked, read, translated, and copied twice over, sitting even then in a drawer in his own nephew's private study, waiting only for the night of the gala to be brought forward. Confidence, Margaret would later reflect, was a peculiar kind of blindness that convinced a man he had accounted for every danger, precisely because it kept him from looking hard enough to find the one danger he had missed entirely. The Solstice Gala was, by tradition, the grandest evening of the Sterling calendar, and Lord George had clearly decided to use its grandeur as cover. He arrived early, ledgers under his arm, and gathered the assembled lords near the fireplace before Julian had even finished greeting his guests. "Friends," George announced in the warm, confident tone of a man who has rehearsed his lines many times, "some of you heard an unfortunate rumor at the midsummer ball concerning my nephew's title to the Lower Valley. I am pleased to put the matter to rest tonight, once and for all, with the original charter itself." He unrolled a parchment with a flourish. Not the true 1485 charter, Margaret realized instantly, but a careful, confident forgery, missing the codicil entirely, its ink too fresh beneath the aged surface of the page. "As you can see, the land belongs, unambiguously, to the House of Sterling." A murmur of relief passed through the crowd, the particular relief of people who prefer a comfortable answer to an inconvenient truth. Margaret, standing near the back among the small cluster of tenant families the vicar's wife had quietly gathered, felt the old fear rise in her chest and set it aside deliberately, the way she had learned to set aside every fear that had not yet proven itself necessary. Julian let the murmur settle before he spoke. "That is not the charter, uncle." The room's temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. George's smile did not so much as flicker. "I beg your pardon, Julian? I said that is not the original charter. I have seen the original. It has been read to me in full, including a codicil your version conveniently omits." Julian turned toward the crowd rather than his uncle, his voice carrying the effortless authority of a man who had finally decided what kind of duke he wanted to be. "Miss Vance, Every head in the ballroom turned as Margaret stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, carrying nothing but her father's worn lexicon and a folded copy of her own careful transcription. She did not look at Lord George. She looked at the assembled lords, at the tenant representatives standing quietly at the back of the room, at every face that had once found her forgettable. "My lords," she said, "I would like to read you the charter Lord George did not bring tonight." For a brief instant before she began, Margaret caught Julian's eye across the width of the ballroom, and something passed between them that needed no words at all, not reassurance exactly, since neither of them could honestly promise the other that the evening would end well, but something steadier than reassurance, a shared understanding that whatever happened next, they had prepared for it as thoroughly as two careful people could prepare for anything. Margaret unrolled her transcription with steady hands, though her heart was beating hard enough that she could feel it in her ears. She began with the original clause, the one carved crudely into stone above the fireplace, and translated it precisely, without embellishment, the way her father had taught her that truth needed no decoration to be believed. "Possession remains with the careful custodian," she read, "until the true heir is restored. This is not a grant of ownership, my lords. It is a condition, a trust, held on behalf of another family, pending their restoration to the land." She turned to the second passage, the hurried shorthand hidden in the margin, and read it slowly enough that even those unfamiliar with Latin could follow the shape of what it meant. A second hand, added perhaps 50 years after the original charter, names the Vance family as joint stewards of this valley, with explicit and permanent right to consent, or refuse, any sale. The room had gone utterly silent, the same silence Margaret remembered from the midsummer ball, except this time it did not frighten her. This time she stood inside it deliberately, having chosen every word. Lord George's composure finally broke. "This is absurd." A companion's forged transcription, produced for a nephew desperate to embarrass his own family. "The original document is on the table behind you, my lord," Julian said calmly. "Brought here tonight by my own steward under guard, the moment I learned you intended to bring a copy instead. Any lord in this room is welcome to examine it himself." He let that settle before he continued. "I have also had the ledgers you have kept for this estate examined this past week, alongside 3 land transactions completed in my name, without my knowledge, in the 2 years since my father's death. Each transaction quietly reduced tenant families to leaseholders on land the codicil says was never entirely ours to sell. And," Margaret added before George could recover, "I have this afternoon received a signed statement from a man named Whitlock, dismissed from this estate some 15 years ago, confirming that he found this same codicil in his years as steward, and was paid to remain silent about it. He has agreed to appear before any magistrate who wishes to hear the account directly." George's face had gone the color of ash. Several of the assembled lords had already begun to draw back from him, the particular retreat of men who had, until moments ago, been prepared to call him a friend. One of the older lords, a man who had known George socially for 30 years, stepped forward and examined the true charter himself, turning it over twice in the candlelight before setting it down with an expression Margaret could not quite read, something between disappointment and quiet fury. "You forged the missing clause out of an old motto," Julian continued. "And you very nearly succeeded, uncle, because you knew I trusted you more than I trusted my own family's history. Miss Vance did not know you. She only knew the document. That is the difference between us. You would take the word of a companion over your own blood," George said, his voice finally losing its practiced warmth entirely. "I would take the word of the document over anyone's blood, uncle, my own included. That is precisely the lesson Miss Vance has spent the last 2 weeks teaching me, at considerable personal cost to herself, while you were teaching me only how to trust the wrong people comfortably." One of the tenant men standing near the back of the room, a farmer Margaret recognized from the chapel pews, spoke then, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. My grandfather signed a lease on that land believing it was the only kindness the Sterling family had ever shown us. If what this lady says is true, it was never kindness at all. It was ours the whole time, and no one bothered to tell us. The room, already silent, seemed to grow more silent still at that, the particular hush of an assembly realizing that the evening's business concerned considerably more than one family's pride. Margaret saw more than one of the assembled lords glance toward the tenant families at the back of the room with an expression she had not seen directed at them before. Not the polite indifference of people accustomed to overlooking servants and farmers alike, but something closer to shame, the recognition of a debt long overdue. By the time the lords had finished examining the true charter for themselves, passing it hand to hand beneath the chandeliers, Lord George Sterling had already been quietly escorted from the ballroom by two of his own former allies, his reputation collapsing behind him with far more speed than it had taken to build. Margaret watched him go and felt, to her own quiet surprise, no satisfaction in it at all, only relief, and beneath the relief, a tiredness so complete it felt almost like grief for how long she had carried this alone before tonight. The tenant families at the back of the ballroom did not cheer, or applaud, or make any grand display at all. They simply stood a little straighter, several of them wiping their eyes with the backs of their hands, and Margaret understood that this quiet, unremarkable reaction was worth more to her than every murmur of approval the ballroom had given the Duke on the night of the midsummer ball. Mrs. Aldridge found her near the great fireplace once the room had begun, slowly, to return to something resembling an ordinary gala, the orchestra uncertain whether it was permitted to resume playing, the guests clustering in small, urgent knots to discuss what they had just witnessed. "You did it," Mrs. Aldridge said simply, taking both of Margaret's hands in hers the way she had in the rectory garden. "You did exactly what you said you would, and you did it without a single word out of place. I had a great deal of help, Mrs. Aldridge. You had a great deal of courage, my dear, which is not the same thing, whatever modesty tells you to call it instead." She glanced across the room to where Julian stood speaking quietly with two of the county's older lords, his posture entirely different than it had been at the midsummer ball, less fortress now, more simply a man standing his ground. "And I think, unless I am very mistaken, you have had a considerable effect on him as well." Margaret did not answer that, though she felt the truth of it settled somewhere she was not yet ready to examine too closely, not with the evening's business barely finished and her hands still faintly trembling from the reading. Julian found her a short while later, near the same tall windows where she had stood the night of the midsummer ball, watching the last of the departing carriages roll away down the long gravel drive by torchlight. He did not speak immediately, only stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, both of them quiet in the particular way of two people who have just survived something together and are not yet certain how to describe it to each other. "You were magnificent," he said finally. "I do not say that lightly, nor as a courtesy. I have watched this county's finest orators address that room 100 times, and none of them held it the way you held it tonight. I was frightened the entire time, Your Grace. I know. I could see it, though I doubt anyone else in that room could. It did not make you any less magnificent. If anything, it made the whole of it more remarkable that you did it despite the fear, rather than because you lacked it." Margaret allowed herself, for the first time that evening, to feel the full weight of what had just happened settle over her, not the triumph of it, which she suspected would take longer to feel properly, but the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of having carried a secret and a fear for weeks and finally set both of them down in front of witnesses who could not now take them back up again on her behalf. "Thank you, Your Grace, for trusting the document over your own family. Thank you," Julian said quietly, "for trusting me enough to help me do it." Lady Beatrice found her shortly after, moving through the departing crowd with her cane and her sharp, satisfied eyes. "I have waited a very long time," the old woman said, "to see this family finally do something worth being proud of. Thank you, Margaret. Whatever comes of tonight, know that an old woman who has seen a great deal of this county's foolishness considers this the finest thing to happen in this house in 30 years. The valley returned to its tenant families within the month, formalized this time by a document Margaret herself helped draft, written in English as well as Latin, so that no future clerk could ever again bury a family's rights inside a language only the powerful bothered to learn. The vicar's wife wept openly when she signed her own family's copy, and pressed both of Margaret's hands between her own for a long moment before either of them could think of anything worth saying aloud. Lord George left the county within the fortnight, his creditors arriving almost as quickly as the news of his disgrace had traveled, and Julian, to Margaret's quiet relief, chose not to pursue him further than the law required. "There is a difference," he told her, "between justice and cruelty, and I find I would rather my family be remembered for the first than the second, however tempting the latter has been this week." The estate itself changed slowly, in the ordinary, unglamorous way that real change tends to arrive. New leases drafted with tenant representatives present at the signing, an English translation added to every document in the archive that had previously existed only in Latin, a small stipend established for any family able to prove an old grievance the estate had failed to honor. None of it made for the kind of story the county's parlors preferred to repeat, and Margaret found she did not mind that in the least. Whitlock was invited back to Sterling Manor that autumn, an old man now, walking slowly with a cane of his own, to see the archive he had once been paid to abandon restored properly, with his name recorded plainly in the estate's records as the steward who had first preserved the codicil rather than destroyed it. He wept, quietly and without embarrassment, when Julian thanked him in front of the assembled household staff, and Margaret found she understood exactly why. 15 years was a long time to carry a secret that no one had asked to hear. The vicar's wife organized a small harvest supper in the lower valley that same season, the first the tenant families had hosted on land they could finally call entirely their own, and Margaret attended at Julian's side, wearing the same modest slate-blue gown she had worn to the midsummer ball, though she noticed, this time, that no one in the crowded barn treated her as though she were meant to disappear into its corners. Children ran between the long tables, and someone's fiddle struck up a tune considerably less formal than anything the Sterling Orchestra had ever played, and Margaret thought, watching it all, that she had never once attended a gathering in this valley that felt so entirely, uncomplicatedly happy. Julian found her in the East Gallery one afternoon in late summer, where the sunlight still fell in the same long gold bars it always had, though the woman standing in them no longer resembled the quiet, forgettable companion who had first caught his attention over a mistranslated word. "I am formally naming you steward of this estate's archive," he said, "with your own office, your own authority to review any document leaving this house, and a salary that reflects what you are actually worth, rather than what a companion is customarily paid." "That is generous, Your Grace. It is overdue, Miss Vance. Overdue by 3 generations if we are being precise about it, which I understand you always are." A faint, unfamiliar warmth crept into his voice, something that had not been there in the ballroom, something that belonged only to this quiet gallery and the two of them standing in it. "I did not fall in love with a duchess's manners or a fortune's promise. I fell in love with a woman who cared more about a dead language telling the truth than she cared about her own safety in speaking it. I do not know how to court someone like that properly. I only know I do not wish to spend another evening in this house without her opinion in it." Margaret allowed herself, for the first time in 6 years, to stand in a room, without trying to disappear from it. "Then perhaps, Your Grace, we begin the way we began before, with a document, read carefully, by 2 people willing to trust what it actually says." He took her hand, this time without hesitation, and the valley below the manor windows caught the last of the evening light exactly the way it had for 300 years, held safe now not by a motto carved in stone, but by two people who had finally read it correctly. Somewhere below, in the lower valley, lamps were being lit in cottages that would, for the first time in living memory, belong entirely to the families who lit them. Margaret thought of her father, of the quiet evenings in his study, of the countless times he had told her that the truth rarely announces itself with fanfare. It simply waits, patiently, in the margin of an old page, for someone careful enough to read it correctly. She thought he would have liked this ending, not for the Duke's hand in hers, though she suspected he would have liked that too, but for the simpler fact that a lie 300 years old had finally been corrected, and a valley full of families no longer had to fear a word they could not read. She thought, too, of the girl she had been at 12, sitting at her father's elbow in this same house, holding fragile parchment up to the window light and being told that honesty was a discipline, not merely a virtue, something practiced daily, in small rooms, long before it was ever tested in a ballroom full of witnesses. She understood now, standing in the gallery with the Duke's hand in hers and the valley's lamps glowing below, that every quiet year of practice had been preparing her for precisely this evening, though she could not have named it at the time. The following spring, when the estate's new tenant agreements were signed formally before the county magistrate, Margaret stood beside Julian at the ceremony not as a companion, and not merely as an archivist, but as the woman the valley's families had begun, quietly and without any grand announcement, to call their own steward as much as his. She did not correct them when they used the title. She had earned it, after all, the same way she had earned everything else in the story, one careful word at a time, read honestly, in a language most of the country had never bothered to learn, and spoken aloud at exactly the moment it mattered most. If you have made it this far, you already know how rare it is to find a love story built on nothing but honesty and an old stubborn respect for the truth. Subscribe to see how this unfolds even further, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.